The press briefing room was packed, every seat occupied by reporters eager to break the next big headline. The air was thick with anticipation, a quiet hum of whispered conversations and the occasional rustle of paper filling the space as everyone prepared for what was to come. At the front of the room, cameras were already rolling, their lenses trained on the podium where Caroline Leavitt would soon appear. As the doors at the back of the room swung open, the chatter hushed slightly, though the tension remained. Caroline walked in with the confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor as she made her way to the front. Her expression was composed, her posture impeccable, giving no indication of the pressure that often accompanied moments like these. She was no stranger to scrutiny, and today would be no different. The briefing room itself was a stage, one she had mastered long ago. Rows of journalists sat before her, some with notepads ready, others with fingers poised over laptop keyboards. A few exchanged glances, already predicting the angles their outlets would take based on how the next few minutes unfolded. The overhead lights cast an artificial glow over everything, emphasizing the expectant faces staring back at her. Without hesitation, Caroline stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and addressed the room. Her voice was steady, professional, practiced. The initial formalities were brief, acknowledgments of attendance, a reminder of the briefing's focus, and a quick summary of the topics at hand. Then, without delay, she opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up instantly, a sea of raised arms signaling just how eager the press corps was to engage. Caroline scanned the room and nodded toward a familiar face, a reporter from a major network who wasted no time in launching into a question about the administration's latest economic policy. Without missing a beat, Caroline responded, her words measured yet firm. She outlined key talking points, citing figures and expected outcomes with the practiced ease of someone who had anticipated this inquiry long before stepping onto the stage. A follow-up question came swiftly, this time pivoting to education reform. Again, Caroline handled it smoothly, reiterating the administration's stance while subtly steering the discussion toward the broader vision for public schooling. She controlled the narrative effortlessly, keeping her responses succinct yet informative, leaving little room for misinterpretation. As she fielded additional questions, some straightforward, others probing, she remained composed. Years of experience had taught her that maintaining control wasn't just about having the right answers, it was about knowing when to push back and when to let a question pass with minimal elaboration. She understood the press well enough to predict which moments would be dissected, replayed, and analyzed, and she carefully navigated each inquiry to avoid unnecessary controversy. Despite her calm exterior, the atmosphere in the room was shifting. Some of the journalists leaned forward slightly, their eyes sharpening as they assessed her responses. The tension wasn't overt, but it was there, building gradually like an undercurrent beneath the routine exchange of information. Caroline noticed it too, though she gave no indication that she did. She knew what was coming. Every briefing had a rhythm, and this one had just reached the point where the questions would begin to push harder. It was only a matter of time before someone attempted to steer the conversation in a direction she hadn't planned. For now, however, she remained in control. The briefing continued, the cameras rolled, and the room collectively waited for the moment that would define the day's headlines. The briefing had settled into its usual rhythm, a well-orchestrated exchange between Caroline Leavitt and the gathered press. Each question was met with a polished response, each follow-up carefully handled to maintain the administration's narrative. The balance between the press and the podium was a delicate one, a constant tug-of-war where both sides sought control, but for the most part, Caroline had kept the momentum in her favor. Then, the shift began. Seated near the front, a reporter known for her relentless questioning leaned forward slightly, her pen tapping against her notepad in a slow, deliberate rhythm. She had built a reputation for pressing issues beyond their neatly packaged answers, often reframing discussions in ways that left officials on the defensive. Her presence alone was enough to suggest that the tone of the briefing was about to change. The moment Caroline acknowledged her with a nod, the first strike came. Unlike the previous inquiries that had focused on policy specifics, this question was broader, laced with implication, carefully phrased to put her in a difficult position. It wasn't an outright accusation, but it danced dangerously close to one, demanding a response that could be dissected and reshaped in headlines before the conference had even ended. Caroline responded swiftly, her tone firm but controlled. She reiterated the administration's stance, reinforcing key points without veering into unnecessary elaboration. It was a measured answer, the kind designed to shut down speculation before it could spiral into something bigger. But the reporter was not so easily deterred. A quick follow-up came, sharper than before, dismissing Caroline's response as insufficient. The words carried a challenge, one that was echoed in the slight smirk playing at the corners of the journalist's lips. She was pushing for something more, something definitive, something that could be framed as either an admission or a refusal to engage. Caroline exhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. She knew this tactic well, had faced it countless times before. Some journalists asked questions in search of information, others asked in search of a moment. And this was quickly becoming the latter. The room had begun to shift around them. Other reporters, sensing the change in atmosphere, exchanged glances, their pens pausing over notebooks, their attention drawn toward the unfolding exchange. The initial hum of polite note-taking was replaced by something else, a quiet, charged stillness as they watched to see how this would play out. Caroline attempted to pivot, redirecting the discussion back to the primary focus of the briefing. But before she could fully regain control, another question came. It was the same topic, reworded slightly, pushing deeper into the narrative the reporter was trying to craft. It was a tactic she recognized immediately, repetition as a tool, making it seem as if a lack of new information meant there was something being deliberately withheld. Again, Caroline answered, this time reinforcing the administration's position with slightly more emphasis, signaling that this was the final word on the matter. But the response was met with yet another pushback, the journalist's voice cutting through the air with an insistence that refused to be ignored. The balance had officially tipped. Now, the interaction was no longer a simple Q&A, it had become a standoff. A silent battle of willpower, where one side demanded absolute clarity and the other refused to be maneuvered into a misstep. The tension in the room had thickened, shifting from subtle curiosity to something far more potent. Caroline could feel it, the weight of every camera trained on her, every journalist waiting to see whether she would hold her ground or falter beneath the pressure. The reporter, emboldened by the moment, leaned in further, pressing her advantage. The rest of the room remained still, hesitant to interrupt. Some of the other journalists looked on with thinly veiled interest, while others appeared uneasy, their eyes darting between Caroline and the reporter. No one wanted to be the one to break the moment, but they all understood what was happening. This was no longer just about policy. It was about control. Caroline straightened, adjusting her stance ever so slightly. She wasn't going to let herself be pulled into a game designed to provoke a reaction. She had spent years navigating rooms like this, facing questions designed not just to extract information but to create spectacle. She had to decide, continue engaging, knowing that every second spent on this exchange would feed the story, or find a way to shut it down entirely. The room watched, waiting for her next move. The energy in the room had changed completely. What had started as a standard press conference had morphed into something else, a standoff that neither side was willing to concede. The usual rhythm of questions and responses had been disrupted, replaced by a singular, relentless demand for a definitive answer. The journalist at the center of it all showed no sign of backing down, her expression sharp with determination as she pressed forward. Caroline remained still, her features unreadable. She had been in this position before. Every administration had its critics, every press secretary faced these moments where the room turned into an arena. Some officials cracked under the weight, letting their irritation slip, giving the exact reaction that was being baited out of them. Caroline wasn't going to be one of them. She kept her tone measured, reinforcing her previous response with unwavering control. She wasn't going to let the discussion veer into speculation, nor would she allow the briefing to be hijacked by one individual's determination to force a moment into existence. She knew that for some journalists, this wasn't about information, it was about performance. And right now, the performance was in full swing. The tension in the room became palpable, stretching across the space like a wire pulled tight. Some journalists glanced at one another, exchanging uncertain looks. They had seen contentious briefings before, but there was something different about this one. The usual back and forth had given way to an almost personal confrontation, a battle of persistence versus restraint. A few reporters shifted in their seats, their pens hovering over notepads, unsure whether to continue taking notes or to simply watch the unfolding spectacle. Some were visibly uncomfortable, their faces betraying an awareness that the situation had escalated beyond the boundaries of a typical press briefing. Others, however, leaned in slightly, intrigued by the confrontation, aware that they were witnessing something that would be analyzed, replayed, and dissected in the hours to come. Caroline remained steady, refusing to engage in the theatrics. She knew the weight of the moment, the way even the subtlest shift in her expression could be captured, dissected, turned into a headline. Every pause, every flicker of irritation, every glance toward the cameras had the potential to be framed as something more than it was. And she wasn't about to give them that. She repeated her stance, closing off any further room for ambiguity. But instead of accepting the response and moving on, the journalist escalated, pushing even harder, reshaping the same question into another variation, demanding an answer that aligned with her own narrative. The insistence in her voice carried through the room, cutting through the underlying hum of tension like a blade. The other journalists took notice of Caroline's restraint. Some silently respected it, others waited to see how long she could maintain it. The reporter, sensing the attention on her, doubled down. She wasn't just pressing for an answer now, she was making a point, ensuring that the cameras caught every second of her persistence. Caroline recognized the tactic instantly. It was no longer about policy, nor about holding the administration accountable. It was about creating a moment, a clip that would be played on news networks, dissected on social media, and turned into fuel for political discourse. It was about positioning herself as the journalist who dared to challenge power, even if the confrontation itself had long since lost its substance. She took a slow breath, keeping her posture composed. This was no longer just a battle of words, it was a test of endurance. The journalist was waiting for frustration to crack through, for a slip in composure that could be spun into a narrative. But Caroline refused to grant her that victory. A murmur rippled through the room as the standoff stretched on. Some of the press corps had begun to lose patience, shifting in their seats, clearly wishing to move past the impasse. A veteran journalist, seated further back, leaned toward a colleague and whispered something under his breath, shaking his head slightly. He had seen these moments before, knew exactly what was happening. The cameras were still rolling, their lenses capturing every movement, every flicker of tension. The weight of expectation hung thick in the air. Caroline, steady and unyielding, held her ground. She wasn't going to let this briefing dissolve into spectacle. She had given her response. The discussion was over. Now, it was a matter of whether the journalist would accept that, or force the situation to escalate further. The air in the briefing room had grown impossibly thick, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on everyone present. The back and forth between Caroline Leavitt and the reporter had stretched beyond the usual boundaries of a press conference, crossing into something far more volatile. What had begun as a simple question had now evolved into a full-scale disruption, one that was no longer about policy, nor even about information. It had become a test of authority, and neither side was willing to back down. Caroline remained composed, her expression unreadable, her posture firm. She had given her answer, and she had made it clear that she would not entertain further attempts to manipulate the conversation. But the reporter refused to let go. Again and again, she pushed, her voice cutting through the uneasy silence like a blade. There was no longer an effort to mask the aggression beneath a veneer of professional inquiry, this was a direct challenge, a refusal to adhere to the structure of the briefing. The shift in the room was undeniable. Other journalists, once spectators to the tense exchange, now sat rigid in their seats, their gazes darting between Caroline and the reporter. Some looked frustrated, annoyed that the disruption was preventing them from asking their own questions. Others watched with something closer to fascination, sensing the way the moment was unfolding into something bigger than just a press conference. A subtle glance from Caroline signaled to the security team stationed near the edges of the room. It was a wordless directive, but it was enough. The briefing had reached its tipping point. A uniformed officer stepped forward, his presence alone shifting the dynamic. The escalation was immediate. The reporter, realizing what was happening, stiffened. The murmur among the press corps grew louder, some shifting in their seats, others glancing at one another in anticipation. The moment had transformed into something else entirely, no longer just a battle of words, but an event that would be dissected, debated, and framed from 100 different angles before the day was over. The journalist remained defiant even as security moved closer, her body language rigid, her expression a mask of calculated outrage. She had been waiting for this, perhaps even anticipating it. The way she held her ground, the way her eyes flicked toward the cameras, all suggested a deeper understanding of the power of perception. The press corps reacted immediately. Some reporters exchanged uncertain glances, hesitating as they weighed the consequences of what was unfolding before them. Others scribbled furiously in their notebooks, already drafting the narratives that would emerge from this moment. A few raised their phones, capturing the confrontation from different angles, ensuring that whatever happened next would not be confined to the walls of the briefing room. Caroline stood firm, refusing to waver. She had seen this before, how a single moment, removed from context, could be spun into something unrecognizable. How a journalist's defiance could be reframed as heroism, while an official's measured response could be twisted into an accusation of suppression. She knew the second this footage left the room, the truth would become secondary to the perception being crafted around it. The journalist made no move to leave voluntarily. Security, now fully engaged, took another step forward. The shift in energy was unmistakable. The press conference was no longer about governance, no longer about policy, it had transformed into a battle over narrative, and everyone present knew it. The cameras captured everything. The slight hesitation before the officer spoke, the way the reporter squared her shoulders as if steeling herself for what came next. The murmur among the journalists grew louder, divided between those who believed the removal was justified and those who saw it as an infringement on press freedom. Then, the inevitable happened. The reporter stood, but not in retreat. Every movement was deliberate, measured. She gathered her notepad, adjusted the strap of her bag, and, with a final glance toward the cameras, turned toward the exit. Every step was a performance, each second calculated to solidify the image that would be broadcast to the public within the hour. The briefing room remained frozen as she walked toward the door, security following closely behind. A heavy silence lingered in the air, the kind that carried the weight of implications yet to unfold. The journalists still seated at their desks exchanged glances, some leaning in to whisper hurriedly to their colleagues. Some appeared unsettled, while others scribbled furiously, already shaping the angle their respective outlets would take. The door closed behind the reporter. A breath of silence followed, brief but significant, before the remaining journalists turned their focus back to the podium. But the press conference had already been lost. The questions that came next were no longer about policy or governance, they were about what had just transpired. A veteran journalist, one who had covered countless administrations, leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slightly as he murmured something under his breath to a colleague. Others, more opportunistic, saw the moment for what it was, a chance to frame the day's headlines, to dictate how the public would perceive what had just unfolded. Outside the room, the fallout had already begun. Clips of the incident were already being uploaded, headlines being written before the dust had even settled. Some painted the moment as a necessary step in maintaining order during an increasingly combative press environment. Others framed it as an egregious act of suppression, a crackdown on journalistic integrity. Caroline knew how this would go. The truth no longer belonged to those in the room, it belonged to the internet, to the news cycles that would twist and reshape every frame of footage to suit a predetermined narrative. She remained steady at the podium, her expression unreadable, as the questions continued. But she knew, even as the briefing pressed on, that the real battle had already begun beyond these walls. Within minutes, the footage was everywhere. News outlets clipped the key moments, social media accounts dissected every second, and commentary flooded in from all sides. Some framed it as a necessary assertion of order in a room where professionalism had broken down. Others called it a chilling moment for the press, an administration openly silencing dissent. The debate exploded across television screens and digital platforms alike, each side reinforcing its own version of what had happened. Caroline Leavitt watched it unfold in real time. Notifications flooded her phone as headlines shifted from policy discussions to a singular focus, the removal of the reporter. Every outlet had its own spin, each reflecting its audience's biases. Some ran with stark condemnations, calling the moment an attack on free speech. Others applauded her for standing firm against grandstanding disguised as journalism. The extremes dominated the conversation, leaving little room for nuance. In the White House Communications Office, her team scrambled to assess the damage. Analysts tracked trending topics, noting which narratives were gaining the most traction. Interns monitored live reactions from media figures, politicians, and influencers, watching as statements poured in, some measured, others outright incendiary. The administration itself took a cautious stance, neither outright condemning nor defending her actions. They issued a neutral statement emphasizing their commitment to an open press while subtly reaffirming the importance of maintaining order in official briefings. It was carefully worded, designed to avoid escalation, yet it did little to shift the already polarizing discourse. Caroline knew damage control required more than just statements. The press operated on perception, and perception had already solidified into battle lines. Some saw her as a symbol of authority and discipline, others painted her as a bureaucrat unwilling to face tough questions. The truth itself was secondary. Her team debated possible responses. Some argued for a direct rebuttal, calling out the reporter's behavior and reminding the public that disrupting a briefing was not the same as holding power accountable. Others suggested a quieter approach, letting the outrage cycle burn itself out as attention inevitably shifted to the next scandal or controversy. Ultimately, they chose transparency as their strategy. The full, unedited footage of the briefing was released, no commentary, no editing, just the raw sequence of events. The hope was that people would see for themselves what had really happened, the repeated interruptions, the clear warnings, the refusal to abide by the structure of the event. It was a calculated move, one that would either defuse the situation or further entrench people into their existing perspectives. The reactions were immediate. Those who had supported Caroline from the start felt vindicated, pointing to the uninterrupted footage as proof that the reporter had crossed a line. Others dismissed it entirely, arguing that even without edits, the underlying issue remained, power shutting down criticism. The debate had never been about facts, it was about perception, and perception rarely changed with evidence alone. Meanwhile, the reporter capitalized on the moment. She made the media rounds, appearing on primetime segments where sympathetic hosts framed her as a journalist simply doing her job, punished for refusing to accept a rehearsed answer. She described the experience in dramatic terms, casting herself as a symbol of press freedom under threat. Invitations to speak poured in, and overnight, she became a cause célèbre among certain political circles. Caroline wasn't surprised. She had seen this play out before, how narratives were built, how moments were seized and transformed into something larger than themselves. It didn't matter that the administration had never refused to take questions or that the reporter had deliberately derailed the briefing. The version of events that gained traction wasn't the one rooted in reality, it was the one that best fit the ideological battle raging across media platforms. The impact stretched beyond the immediate controversy. Future briefings carried a different tone, a quiet awareness that the rules of engagement had changed. Every journalist in the room understood that moments like these could define careers, not just for press secretaries but for reporters as well. Some leaned into the spectacle, eager to create their own viral moment. Others grew more cautious, recognizing the fine line between pressing for answers and turning a press conference into personal theater. Caroline adjusted accordingly. She continued her role with the same professionalism as always, but the way she navigated the room had shifted. Every response was now weighed not just for accuracy but for its potential to be clipped, twisted, or taken out of context. Every pause, every glance toward the cameras, every decision to acknowledge or dismiss a question carried new weight. Despite everything, she remained steady. She had done her job, answered the questions that were relevant, and maintained order when it was necessary. The rest, the outrage, the spin, the attempts to shape her into either a villain or a champion, was beyond her control. The media storm raged on for days, but eventually, as expected, the news cycle moved forward. Other controversies emerged, new debates took center stage, and the fervor surrounding the press conference began to fade. The reporter continued leveraging the moment for personal gain, while Caroline remained exactly where she had been before, at the podium, addressing the press, maintaining control of the message. Yet the lesson lingered. It wasn't enough to tell the truth. In an era where perception dictated reality, even the facts could be manipulated, restructured, and repackaged to fit a predetermined narrative. Caroline understood that now more than ever. And she knew it wouldn't be the last time she had to face it.